The streets of forgotten dreams. The city stretched high above her, an endless sea of gleaming steel and glass that reached into the sky. The buildings were monuments to ambition, towering symbols of the hustle and drive that defined the lives of the people who walked beneath them. But for Raina, the streets were not a place of dreams. They were a place where the world had forgotten her, and she had learned to survive without ever being seen. Raina, a small, thin girl of only 10, had never known the warmth of a family or the comfort of a home. She had been left to navigate a cold, uncaring world after both her parents passed away in an accident when she was just a toddler. Her only companions were the harsh winds and the distant lights that flickered in the distance as the city buzzed with life. Life had never been kind to Raina, but it had made her resilient. Every day, she found herself sitting on the same corner of the busiest street in the city, the one where people passed by in a constant rush, their faces either too busy or too indifferent to acknowledge the small beggar girl sitting on the cold pavement. Her clothes were ragged, worn thin by the constant wear and tear of the unforgiving streets, and her tiny hands clutched a tin cup, hoping for spare change from the few kind souls who passed by. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a piece of stale bread or a warm drink when the weather grew unbearable. She learned to blend into the backdrop of the city, like a shadow no one noticed or cared for. The strangers who walked past would cast brief glances in her direction, some with pity, some with disgust, but all with a sense of superiority that reminded her of how little she mattered in this vast, bustling world. But there was a spark of brightness in Raina's eyes, an innocence that remained untouched by the darkness of the world around her. She never stole, never resorted to the cruel tricks some of the older beggars used to survive. She believed in kindness, even if it was a rare thing to find in the concrete jungle she called home. Instead, Raina relied on the small gestures of compassion that a few generous strangers would occasionally offer. A few coins, a warm smile, a kind word. It was never enough to change her circumstances, but it was enough to remind her that there was some goodness left in the world, even if it was fleeting. That night, the city was colder than usual. The wind whipped through the streets, carrying the scent of rain and something faintly metallic. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the sidewalks as the noise of the crowd rose and fell in waves. Raina huddled closer to her corner, trying to shield herself from the biting wind, her eyes scanning the busy street for any sign of an opportunity. She had learned long ago to watch for moments, small openings where she could catch a glimpse of hope, however fleeting. It was in one of these moments, as the crowd surged and shifted around her, that she saw something strange. A man in a sharp, tailored suit rushing through the crowd. His face was sharp and impersonal, his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his phone as he spoke quickly into it, a deep frown creasing his brow. He was clearly a man of wealth. His polished shoes gleamed under the streetlights, his expensive watch gleamed in the glow of a nearby sign. His aura of success was undeniable, and for a brief moment, Raina wondered what it would be like to live in a world like his, where people didn't have to beg for scraps, where there was no hunger gnawing at your stomach every day. But as he hurried past, something caught Raina's eye, a glint of black plastic slipping from his pocket. The credit card, sleek and shiny, fell onto the pavement with a quiet clink. Raina blinked, her heart racing. No one noticed. The man was too absorbed in his conversation, his footsteps growing fainter as the crowd moved away. She could have let it go. She could have watched it drift away, lost in the city like so many other things, but for the first time in a long while, a strange thought crept into her mind. What if this is my chance? She didn't know what a credit card was. Not really. She had seen people use them in the shops from time to time, but she had never paid much attention. All she knew was that it was a piece of something that seemed to matter, a thing that held value in a world where she had none. Her instincts told her to return it, to do the right thing and hand it back to its rightful owner. But something else, something darker, tugged at her heart. The gnawing hunger, the ache of an empty stomach, the desperation of living a life on the edge. With trembling hands, she picked it up. It was cool to the touch, sleek and smooth. The name on the card read Vincent Grayson. The name meant nothing to her, but the look of the card, the expensive material, the bold letters, told her it belonged to someone important, someone who could afford things she could only dream of. What if this card could change everything for her? Her fingers wrapped around it tightly, a wave of guilt sweeping over her. She wasn't a thief. She had never taken anything that wasn't given to her. But in that moment, the weight of the card in her palm felt like a fleeting opportunity, one she might never get again. Her mind raced as she looked around at the cold, indifferent world she lived in. No one cared for her, no one saw her, and for the first time in her life, she had something that might make people pay attention. Raina hesitated for a long moment. She could hear the bustle of the city around her, the sounds of people living their lives without a care for her existence. The shadows seemed to close in around her, as if the city itself were watching, waiting to see what she would do. She glanced back at the crowd, but the man was already gone, swallowed up by the sea of faces. It would be so easy to slip into the stores, to buy food, to buy clothes, to buy anything she wanted. But instead of acting on impulse, she stood still, her heart racing. For a moment, she thought she might throw the card away and forget it ever happened. But when she felt the hunger deep in her gut, it reminded her of the life she had led for so long, one of survival, of making do with whatever scraps were left behind. No one would notice, she told herself. It would be just one card, one time. She wasn't going to keep it. She would return it, after just one meal, one change of clothes. And when she did, perhaps things would be different. Perhaps for the first time in her life, she could have something more than what the street gave her. Raina tucked the card into her coat pocket, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and guilt. The city around her continued to rush forward, but she felt as though time itself had stopped. This was a moment, a fleeting chance, and no matter what happened next, it was hers. The weight of choices. The following morning, Raina's feet hit the cold pavement with the usual quiet determination. She had spent a restless night, her mind swirling with thoughts of the card tucked away in her pocket. She had tried to sleep, to close her eyes and forget the hunger gnawing at her, but every time she did, she saw the card again, as if it had imprinted itself on her mind. It wasn't just a piece of plastic, it was a promise, a fleeting glimpse of something different. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Raina felt a spark of hope, fragile though it was. The city around her was waking up, the sounds of traffic blending with the distant hum of conversations and the occasional honk of a horn. The streets were filling with people, rushing, hustling, chasing their own ambitions. Most of them paid her no mind, just as they never did. They moved like a tide, a sea of faces that never lingered, never paused long enough to notice the little beggar girl crouched by the curb. Yet today felt different. Her hand brushed the pocket where she had hidden the card. The weight of it felt heavier now, as though it carried the weight of a decision she hadn't yet made. The world was offering her a chance, an opportunity that had never come before, but with that opportunity came a price. She couldn't help but wonder if she was worthy of such a chance, if she deserved anything more than what she already had. With a deep breath, Raina pushed those doubts aside. She had made a decision, and today she would act on it. She walked through the busy streets with a sense of purpose, her eyes scanning the windows of shops and the food displays inside. The smell of fresh bread and coffee wafted through the air, and her stomach growled in protest. The hunger was a constant companion, a reminder of how little she had. But today, she wouldn't just survive. She would take a step into a world that had always seemed beyond her reach. The supermarket loomed ahead, its glass doors shining in the morning light. Raina paused before stepping inside, her heart racing. She was not used to places like this, places where people came to buy, not beg. But there was no going back now. She had the card. She had the chance. And for once, she wasn't just the forgotten child on the street. She was someone with something to offer, someone with a piece of the world in her hands. The automatic doors slid open, and Raina stepped inside. The cool air of the supermarket washed over her, and she felt a strange thrill mixed with a sense of discomfort. The aisles were filled with people, some chatting on their phones, some pushing carts full of groceries, while others navigated the shelves with practiced ease. Raina felt small among them, out of place, but she ignored the feeling. She had made up her mind. She began to walk slowly down the aisles, picking up items one by one. Cans of soup, a loaf of fresh bread, fruit that looked ripe and sweet. Her fingers lingered on the cold metal of the shopping cart, and as she filled it with food, she felt an unfamiliar sensation: joy. This was something she had never experienced before. To be able to choose food, to fill a cart with items she knew she could never afford. There was something liberating about it, even if it was only temporary. Her next stop was the clothing section. She eyed a row of warm jackets, the kind she had always seen in the store windows, but never dared to touch. Raina pulled one down from the rack and held it against her small frame. The fabric was soft, warm, and thick, far better than the ragged jacket she had been wearing for months. She slid the sleeves onto her arms and stood there for a moment, looking at herself in the mirror. For the first time in a long while, she looked like she belonged somewhere, like she wasn't just a shadow in the corner of the street. The jacket fit perfectly. She smiled to herself. But that smile faded quickly when she reached the checkout counter. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead as she approached the cashier. She had the card, Vincent Grayson's card. But now, standing before the register, it felt less like an opportunity and more like a gamble. What if it didn't work? What if the cashier questioned her? What if someone found out that she had taken it in the first place? With trembling hands, Raina pulled the card from her pocket and handed it over to the cashier. The woman glanced at it, then back at Raina, her face unreadable. Without a second glance, she swiped the card through the machine. The screen blinked, and for a moment, everything felt suspended in time. Raina held her breath, the sound of the machine's beep echoing in her ears. Then the machine made a soft ping, and the cashier smiled at her. "Approved," she said, and Raina felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest. It worked. The card had worked. A strange feeling washed over her. She should have been elated, should have felt victorious. But instead, a sharp pang of guilt twisted in her stomach. This wasn't her card, and yet she had used it as if it were. She had stolen it, or at least taken it with the intention of stealing. Her thoughts raced, and she realized she didn't want this life. She didn't want to be the kind of person who took things that didn't belong to her, even if it was from a rich man who wouldn't notice it was gone. She grabbed her bags and fled the store, her hands shaking. She didn't want to keep the clothes or the food. She didn't want to keep any of it if it meant living with the knowledge that she had used someone else's life to fill her own. The world outside the store felt colder than before, and she found herself looking down at the ground, her steps heavy with uncertainty. But as she walked, the guilt began to fade, replaced by something else, a determination. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't keep the card. She wouldn't allow herself to live a life built on lies, even if it meant going back to nothing. Raina turned a corner, her mind already focused on the task ahead. She would find Vincent Grayson. She would return the card. But something inside her told her that this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. The beginning of something bigger, something she didn't fully understand yet, but knew she couldn't ignore. As she walked through the crowded streets, her eyes scanning the towering buildings around her, Raina felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was her chance to change her life. Maybe this time, someone would see her. Maybe this time, someone would care. And maybe, just maybe, she would find something more valuable than food or clothes or money. She would find something that no card could buy. A family, a place where she belonged. And so, with the weight of the card heavy in her pocket, Raina took the first step toward finding Vincent Grayson. What she asked for next would change both their lives forever. A path unseen. Raina's footsteps echoed through the streets, steady and purposeful. The cool breeze from the morning had faded into a humid warmth, and the city had shifted from a place of cold indifference to one of bustling energy. Yet as she walked, she felt the weight of Vincent Grayson's credit card, still lodged in her pocket, like a constant reminder of the decision she had made. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though she were carrying a burden far greater than the card itself. She knew she had to return it. She couldn't keep it, not after what it had already cost her, but she also knew that her actions had already set something into motion. There was no going back now. Raina's mind raced with questions as she walked. How would she find Vincent Grayson? How would she explain herself? She didn't know anything about the man whose life she had briefly entered. She only knew that he was important, that his name was one of the few she had heard mentioned in the conversations of the city's elite. Vincent Grayson was a name tied to power, wealth, and success, and yet Raina's heart told her that there was more to him than just the polished exterior his wealth afforded. The way he had walked past her yesterday, oblivious to the card slipping from his pocket, spoke volumes about the distance he kept between himself and the world around him. But perhaps, just perhaps, Raina thought, that distance was something she could bridge. The city was a labyrinth of glass and steel, and as Raina wandered through its vast, impersonal streets, she found herself feeling more lost than ever. Where could she go to find a man who lived in a world so far removed from hers? She had heard people mention his name in the newspapers and on television. He was a businessman, a self-made millionaire whose rise to success had been heralded as the epitome of the American dream. But what else was there to know? What was his life like beyond the shiny suits and luxurious cars? Determined, Raina moved with newfound resolve. She knew where to start. If Vincent Grayson was the public figure everyone made him out to be, then it wouldn't be hard to track him down. She had learned long ago to navigate the city's labyrinthine streets with a keen eye, looking for the faintest clues, the smallest signs that could lead her to what she was searching for. After several hours of walking, asking a few questions along the way, and dodging a couple of security guards who eyed her suspiciously, Raina finally found herself standing in front of a massive office building, a gleaming skyscraper that towered above the rest of the city's skyline. The Grayson Corporation's logo gleamed on the entrance, and even from the outside, the building exuded an air of authority and power. The revolving doors spun open, allowing people in and out with practiced efficiency. Raina paused, looking up at the building. She had never felt so small in her life. This was it. The world she had never belonged to was now just a few steps away. But as she stood there, her heart began to race. She was just a girl from the streets. What would someone like Vincent Grayson want with her? She didn't belong here. The guards, the polished marble floors, the glittering glass walls, they all seemed to mock her. But Raina's resolve was stronger than her self-doubt. She had come this far. She would go further. Taking a deep breath, Raina stepped into the lobby. The cool air hit her face like a wave, and she looked around at the polished marble floors and towering columns. There were people everywhere, men and women in business suits, carrying briefcases and phones, walking briskly as if they had somewhere to be. The receptionist at the front desk barely glanced up as Raina approached, her fingers tapping away at her keyboard. "Excuse me," Raina said quietly, her voice small in the vast, sterile space. The receptionist finally looked up, her expression neutral, but with a hint of disapproval as she took in Raina's ragged appearance. "Yes, can I help you?" she asked, her voice cool. I need to see Mr. Grayson," Raina said, feeling the words catch in her throat. The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Grayson is a very busy man. You'll need an appointment." "I don't have one," Raina said, clutching the credit card in her pocket. She could feel its edges digging into her skin, and the thought of handing it over to someone who didn't care made her stomach churn. "But I have something for him. I found something that belongs to him." The receptionist studied Raina for a moment, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Mr. Grayson doesn't accept unannounced visitors," she said, her voice firm. "Please leave." Raina felt her heart sink, but she wasn't ready to give up. There had to be another way. "Please," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "I really need to speak to him. It's important. I found his credit card." The mention of the credit card made the receptionist pause. Her eyes flickered with interest, and she set down the phone she had been holding. "You found Mr. Grayson's credit card?" she asked, her tone more curious now. "Yes," Raina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to keep it. I just want to return it to him." The receptionist seemed to consider this for a moment, then stood up, her heels clicking on the marble floor. "Wait here," she said, before walking briskly toward the elevator. Raina stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides. Was this really happening? Would she get to meet the man whose card she had taken? The elevator doors opened, and the receptionist gestured for Raina to follow her. The elevator ride was silent, the hum of the machinery the only sound. As they ascended to the higher floors, Raina's nerves began to fray. She was so out of place here. This was a world she had never known, a world that didn't care about a girl like her. She wasn't anyone important, not to them. But for some reason, the receptionist had believed her, and that belief felt like a lifeline in a world that had given her nothing but indifference. The doors opened, revealing a sleek, glass-walled office filled with light. It was pristine and immaculate, filled with expensive furniture and framed awards on the walls. In the center of it all stood Vincent Grayson, his back to her as he spoke into a phone, his voice low and authoritative. The receptionist gestured for Raina to stay quiet, and Raina nodded, clutching the credit card tightly in her hand. As she waited, she couldn't help but wonder what this man would think when he saw her. Would he be angry? Would he dismiss her as just another street urchin who had wandered into his life, only to leave without a trace? She had no idea. But as Vincent finally turned around, his eyes narrowed in confusion as they locked on her. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, something unreadable. Then he turned his attention to the credit card in her hand. "I think this belongs to you," Raina said softly, holding it out to him, her voice trembling. Vincent's eyes scanned her face, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. In the silence, the weight of their worlds, the vast gulf between them, seemed impossible to bridge. Yet in that brief exchange, something shifted. Something unspoken passed between them, something that neither of them could ignore. Raina's heart beat faster as Vincent slowly walked toward her. She didn't know it then, but this was the moment when everything would change. The moment when both their lives would be forever altered. The unspoken bond. Vincent Grayson stood still for a moment, his sharp gaze fixated on Raina, the small, ragged girl standing before him. His office, which had once felt like a sanctuary of power and control, now seemed like a hollow shell, a space where his carefully constructed life felt suddenly fragile, even absurd. The girl, so out of place in the world he had built, held out the credit card like an offering. Her eyes were wide with a strange mixture of fear and courage, and despite her dirt-streaked clothes and the wariness etched on her young face, there was something undeniably compelling about her. Raina's heart raced. She wasn't sure what she expected from Vincent Grayson. Maybe anger, maybe indifference, but she hadn't expected the look in his eyes. There was something almost haunted there, a flicker of something that made Raina's breath catch in her throat. She had thought of him as just another wealthy businessman, just another person too far removed from her reality to care. But standing before him now, she realized that there was more to this man than just the wealth and success that defined him. Vincent reached out slowly, taking the credit card from her trembling hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and for a fleeting moment, Raina felt the coldness in his touch. It wasn't the kind of coldness she had come to expect from strangers. It was the kind of coldness that came from a person who had spent too long hiding from the world, too long building walls to protect themselves from the things they could not face. He looked down at the card, his expression unreadable. "You found this. And you didn't keep it." His voice was low, almost incredulous, as if he couldn't fathom why someone would do such a thing. Raina shifted uneasily on her feet. She wasn't sure how to explain herself. How could she? What words could capture the complex swirl of emotions she felt in this moment? Guilt, hope, fear, and oddly enough, a sense of relief. The fact that she had returned the card was both a simple act of honesty and a desperate cry for something more. "I needed it," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't want to steal it. I just wanted something to eat, something to wear." She paused, her eyes drifting downward for a moment, unwilling to meet his gaze. "I don't want your money. I don't want your things. I just want a family." Her words hung in the air between them like a fragile thread, a truth she had carried for so long, but never dared to voice until now. Vincent's expression flickered, the lines of his face tightening as though her words had struck him somewhere deep. He looked at her, his eyes searching, as though trying to decipher the hidden meaning behind her simple request. Raina's hands clenched nervously at her sides, and she felt the weight of the room closing in on her. A family. Vincent's voice was quiet, almost distant, as though the word itself was foreign to him. "You want a family." Raina nodded slowly, her chest tightening with an emotion she couldn't name. "I don't want money, or a house or clothes. I just want someone who cares, someone who sees me." Her voice cracked, and she quickly wiped away the tear that threatened to fall. "I don't have anyone. No one looks at me. I'm just invisible." The silence in the room stretched, and Vincent stood frozen, the credit card still in his hand. Raina couldn't read the emotions playing across his face: anger, confusion, pity, or perhaps something else entirely. But as the silence continued, she felt a strange sensation beginning to well up inside her, a quiet certainty. She had asked for the one thing that no amount of money or luxury could buy. And somehow, despite the seeming absurdity of her request, she wasn't afraid of the rejection she might face. It was then that Vincent did something unexpected. He set the credit card down on the polished surface of his desk and slowly walked toward her. There was no hurry in his steps, no urgency, just a quiet determination that seemed to echo the turmoil in his eyes. He stopped just a few feet away from her, his gaze intense and thoughtful. Raina held her breath, unsure of what to expect next. But then, to her surprise, Vincent knelt down to her level, so that they were face to face. She had never been this close to someone like him before, someone so powerful, so untouchable. His presence was overwhelming, but there was something else, a vulnerability in the way his eyes softened, just for a moment. "Why do you want a family?" he asked, his voice almost gentle, as though he were speaking to a child. Yet his words held an unexpected weight. "Why not just live for yourself? Why not just take what you need and move on? Why a family?" Raina swallowed hard, the question catching her off guard. She hadn't expected him to ask her why. But as she thought about it, she realized that her desire wasn't just about having people around. It was about connection, about love, and about belonging. Because I want to feel like I matter," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to matter to someone. I want to be more than just a beggar. I want to be part of something. Someone's daughter, someone's sister. I want to know what it feels like to be cared for, to be wanted." Vincent stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Raina's shock, he reached out and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a mountain shifting. Something deep within him, something that had been buried for so long, had finally stirred. I don't know how to give you what you want," he said quietly, his voice tinged with a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "I don't know how to be a father, or even a friend. I've been too busy chasing things I thought mattered. Money, success, power. But I think I've lost what matters most." Raina's heart pounded in her chest. Was this what she had been waiting for? Had she truly broken through the walls Vincent had built around himself? Vincent took a deep breath, his hand still resting on her shoulder. I can't promise you everything you want. I don't know how to give you a family, Raina, but I can try. Her eyes widened, hope blossoming within her like the first rays of sunlight after a long storm. You mean, you'd try to? Vincent nodded slowly, his gaze softening. I've been running for so long, hiding from everything that really matters. Maybe it's time to stop. Maybe it's time to try something different. Maybe you and I could both learn what it means to have a family. Raina didn't know what to say. She hadn't expected this, not in a million years. The walls that had seemed so insurmountable just moments before now appeared to be crumbling, and in their place, something new was beginning to form. She felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a quiet hope that whispered to her that maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something more. Vincent stood up, and Raina looked up at him, her heart still racing. I'm not perfect, he said, almost as though reassuring himself. But I'll try. I'll try to give you the one thing you want. A family. Tears welled up in Raina's eyes as she nodded, her lips trembling with emotion. Thank you. And in that moment, the impossible seemed possible. They had both been searching for something more than just wealth, more than just success. In their shared silence, they had found it. The connection they had both been longing for, the bond they had never dared to hope for. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be theirs. And for the first time in a long while, both Raina and Vincent felt like they had a chance at something real, something that could change everything. The unseen bridges. In the days that followed, Raina found herself in a world she had never imagined. A world where warmth wasn't just a fleeting feeling, but something that surrounded her. It wasn't the world of opulence she had briefly tasted in the supermarket, but it was something better. Something real. Vincent Grayson's home, which once seemed cold and intimidating, now felt strangely welcoming. The polished floors, the towering windows that let in the soft light of the setting sun. It was all a far cry from the city's streets, yet it didn't feel as unfamiliar as it once had. For the first time in years, Raina allowed herself to sleep in a bed, the softness of the sheets a luxury she had never known. The simple act of lying down without the hard pavement pressing against her bones was a comfort beyond words. But more than that, it was the presence of Vincent, a man who, despite his hardened exterior, had opened up to her in a way no one had before. They spent the first few days in an awkward silence, their pasts hovering between them like an invisible wall. Vincent, still unsure of how to begin this strange new chapter of his life, kept his distance. He didn't know how to be a father. He didn't know how to be the man Raina needed him to be. His daughter, Claire, had all but disowned him after years of neglect and broken promises. And yet, here was Raina, a girl who had never asked for anything, now sitting quietly at his dining table, looking to him for something he wasn't sure he could give. Raina, for her part, kept mostly to herself in the early days. She had never been good at asking for help, had never learned how to lean on others without feeling like a burden. Her quiet presence in the house was both a comfort and a reminder of the world she had left behind. The city streets, the cold winds, the whispers of pity, they all seemed so distant now, but they were never truly gone. The feeling of being invisible, of being nothing more than a shadow in the crowd, still lingered in her heart. She hadn't forgotten who she was. It was during these quiet days that Vincent began to notice the subtle ways Raina interacted with the world around her. She was polite but distant, always hesitating before speaking, as if unsure whether her words would be welcomed. At dinner, she picked at her food, never taking more than she needed. When Vincent asked her how she was feeling, she would smile faintly, but the smile never reached her eyes. She was trying to be grateful, he could tell. But there was something in her, a guardedness, an unease, that made him feel as though he were a stranger in her life, even though he had opened his door to her. One evening after dinner, Raina stood by the large window in the living room, looking out over the city below. The lights of the skyline twinkled in the distance, but Raina didn't seem to see them. Her thoughts were far away, lost in a place Vincent couldn't quite reach. He stood in the doorway, watching her, wondering what went through her mind when she stared at the world outside. She heard his footsteps behind her and turned slowly. "I'm not used to all of this," she said quietly, her voice almost apologetic. Vincent took a step forward, leaning against the doorframe. "I understand," he replied softly. "This is a lot to take in, but if you want to talk about it, I'm here." Raina shook her head, her expression distant. "It's not that. It's just," she faltered, struggling to put her feelings into words. "I'm not used to feeling like I belong, like I have a place here. I don't know how to fit in." Vincent's heart clenched as he watched her. He could see it now, the fear of being an intruder in a world that wasn't made for her, the quiet ache of someone who had never had a home, never had a place to call their own. He knew that his offer to help couldn't erase the scars of her past, couldn't fix the loneliness she had carried with her for so long. "Raina," he said gently, stepping closer. "You belong here. You're not a guest, not a burden. You're part of this family now, whether you believe it or not." His words hung in the air between them, and he could see the hesitation in her eyes. "It's going to take time, but we'll figure this out together. I may not know how to be a father, but I'll learn. We can learn from each other." Raina didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, her gaze fixed on the lights below. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "I don't know if I can believe that," she whispered, her voice so soft that Vincent barely caught it. "I don't know if I'll ever believe that I matter enough for anyone to really care." Vincent felt his chest tighten. "You do matter," he said, his voice firm, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. "More than you know." That night, Vincent sat alone in his study, the weight of Raina's words heavy on his heart. What had he been running from all these years? His wealth, his success, the endless pursuit of more. None of it had filled the emptiness inside him. It had all been a distraction, a way to avoid the very thing he now found himself face to face with, the need for connection, for love, for belonging. But it wasn't just about Raina. It was about him too. He had been as lost as she had, caught in a cycle of self-justification, trying to make up for the years he had spent prioritizing career over everything else. But he couldn't undo the past. What mattered now was the present. What mattered now was Raina. The next morning, after a restless night of reflection, Vincent found Raina sitting on the steps leading to the garden. She was staring out at the flowers in the early morning light, her legs drawn up to her chest. She didn't hear him approach, so he stood there for a moment, watching her, unsure of what to say. Finally, he spoke, his voice hesitant. "You know, when I was younger, I thought that everything I needed was out there. Success, money, power. I thought I could control everything. But the truth is, I've been running from the very things that matter the most." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I don't want to run anymore. I want to try. With you, if you'll let me." Raina looked up at him, her expression softening ever so slightly. She didn't say anything at first, but the guardedness in her eyes seemed to melt away just a little. "I think," Raina began slowly, her voice tentative, as if she wasn't sure if she should even say the words. "I think I'd want to try too." And just like that, something shifted between them. It wasn't immediate, nor was it perfect. There was still so much to unravel, so much healing to do. But in that moment, something had begun, a connection that neither of them had ever known before. Neither Vincent nor Raina knew what the future held, but they both knew they weren't alone anymore. As the days passed, the house began to feel more like a home, though there were still moments of doubt, moments of silence that spoke louder than words. But with each passing day, they found small ways to bridge the gap between them. A shared meal, a quiet conversation, a walk through the garden in the evening. And little by little, Raina began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she had found what she had been looking for all along. A place where she belonged. A family. Vincent, too, began to understand that true wealth wasn't measured by the size of one's bank account or the number of accolades collected over a lifetime. It was measured by the bonds he built, the love he shared, and the connections that gave his life meaning. What he had thought was the pinnacle of success was only a stepping stone to something deeper, something that money could never buy. Together, they would learn that the road ahead wasn't about perfection. It was about understanding, patience, and the willingness to try. Again and again. They had both been lost, but now, they were on the same path. And for the first time, that path didn't seem so lonely. The first steps toward healing. As the weeks turned into months, Raina and Vincent began to carve out a tentative routine in the strange new life they were building together. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always smooth. There were days when silence filled the spaces between them, when the weight of their pasts seemed to bear down on their shoulders. Yet in those quiet moments, there was an unspoken understanding. They were both learning to navigate uncharted territory. Vincent, the successful businessman, learning to open his heart again, and Raina, the girl who had grown up invisible, learning to trust and believe in her own worth. Raina had never been good at asking for help. She had always taken care of herself, even when she didn't have the strength to do so. She had learned early on that the world didn't offer help without expecting something in return, that kindness was often a currency given with strings attached. But here, in Vincent's home, there were no strings, no conditions. And though it frightened her at times, it also felt like a lifeline she couldn't ignore. Vincent had his own struggles. He had spent years focusing on work, shutting himself off from relationships and emotions. His marriage had ended in bitter silence, and his relationship with his daughter, Claire, had frayed beyond repair. The guilt he carried from those years of neglect was a constant companion, and the thought of being a father, even in the most basic sense, was daunting. But Raina had asked for something he couldn't ignore. A family. And while he wasn't sure if he could give her all that she wanted, he knew he had to try. One chilly morning, as the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, Raina sat on the balcony, her legs tucked underneath her as she watched the city awaken below. She had come to love the quiet moments in the morning, before the world started moving at its usual breakneck pace. The peace, the stillness. It gave her time to think, to breathe. It was in these moments that she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the streets, beyond the hunger and cold that had once defined her existence. Vincent found her there, standing at the threshold of the balcony, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't say anything at first. He had learned that sometimes Raina needed silence more than anything else. But today, something felt different. There was an openness in the air, a shift that made the walls between them seem just a little thinner. "Raina," he said softly, stepping outside and joining her by the railing. "I've been thinking." She turned to him, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "That's dangerous," she teased gently, her voice light. Vincent smiled, the expression unfamiliar but welcome. "Maybe," he admitted, "but seriously, I've been thinking about what you said, about family." Raina raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. She had never imagined Vincent would think much about the request she had made months ago, the one she had thought was too much to ask. "I want to try," Vincent continued, his gaze steady and sincere. "I want to be here for you, Raina. I know I'm not perfect, and I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers, but I want to try. I know it's going to take time. There are a lot of things I need to make right, but I want to be part of your life. I don't want to be the guy who hides behind his wealth anymore, pretending that it's enough." Raina's heart swelled at his words, a warmth blossoming in her chest. She had never thought she would hear those words from Vincent. She had always believed that people like him, people with everything, could never understand the pain of someone like her. But here he was, offering her something more valuable than anything money could buy: his presence, his willingness to be part of her world. "You don't have to be perfect," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to try." Vincent nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a depth that made her feel like she wasn't so invisible after all. "I'll try," he said, his voice firm, as though making a promise he intended to keep. "We both will." And in that moment, something began to change between them. It wasn't a sudden transformation, nor was it immediate, but it was the first true step toward healing, for both of them. The first step toward building a family, not out of blood or shared history, but from something even stronger: understanding, empathy, and a willingness to be vulnerable. As the days went by, Vincent and Raina began to spend more time together. Their conversations grew deeper, less guarded. Vincent shared stories of his childhood, of his journey from a young man with little to his name to the billionaire he had become. He spoke of the sacrifices he had made, the relationships he had lost, and the loneliness he had hidden behind his success. Raina, in turn, opened up about her life on the streets, the fear she had lived with every day, and the dreams she had never dared to hope for. They learned to laugh together, too. Raina had a dry wit, an ability to find humor in the darkest of situations, and Vincent couldn't help but be drawn to her resilience. He marveled at her ability to see the good in people, even after everything she had been through. And Raina, for the first time in a long time, began to see Vincent not as the faceless, unreachable millionaire, but as someone who had suffered, who had made mistakes, and who was still learning how to live with them. It wasn't always easy. There were days when Vincent would retreat into his work, his old habits pulling him away from the intimacy they were trying to build. There were days when Raina's past would bubble up, making her feel unworthy, like an imposter in the life Vincent had created. But with each passing day, they learned to meet each other halfway. They learned to let go of their fears, to be patient with one another, and to understand that healing wasn't something that happened overnight. It was something that came in small moments, in quiet gestures, in the slow, steady effort to build trust. One evening, as they sat together on the couch in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace flickering in the background, Vincent turned to Raina, his eyes thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about your idea, about family." Raina glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Oh." Vincent smiled faintly, but there was something warm in his gaze. I think I want to make this official. I want to give you something you've never had, something real." Raina's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what Vincent meant, but something told her that this was more than just an idle thought. He reached for a small box on the coffee table and opened it, revealing the simple silver necklace. "This is for you," he said softly. "It's not much, but it's a symbol, a promise, that you're not alone anymore, that you're part of this family, my family." Raina's breath caught in her throat. The gesture was small, but the meaning behind it was monumental. For the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged. Not because of what Vincent could give her, but because he was offering her something far more precious: acceptance, love, and a place in his heart. Tears filled her eyes as she reached out to take the necklace, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Vincent replied quietly, his voice full of tenderness. "Just be here, with me, with us." And in that moment, Raina realized something that she had never fully understood before. Family wasn't just about blood. It wasn't about the past. It was about the present, about the people who chose to stand by you, to see you for who you were, and to love you despite everything. Together, Vincent and Raina had taken their first steps toward healing. And though they both knew the road ahead would have its challenges, they also knew that they were no longer walking it alone. The full circle. As the months passed, Vincent and Raina's bond deepened in ways neither of them had ever anticipated. It was a bond forged not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, everyday moments that make up the fabric of life. Raina had found not just a home, but a family. Vincent had found more than a chance to redeem himself. He had found a new purpose. They were no longer strangers bound by shared space, but two people who had learned to see each other fully, to embrace each other's flaws and strengths. Raina's life slowly began to transform. She started school for the first time in years, a nervous but hopeful girl who found joy in the small victories, learning to read and write, making her first real friends, and discovering a world she had never known beyond the streets. Vincent helped her navigate this new world, attending parent-teacher meetings, listening to her frustrations, and offering guidance when she needed it. He wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, still times when he fell short. But he never gave up on her, and she never gave up on him. Raina also helped Vincent in ways he had never imagined. She taught him the true meaning of family, what it really meant to care for someone without the expectation of anything in return. She showed him that love wasn't a transaction, but a choice, one that required patience, vulnerability, and acceptance. She reminded him, every day, that wealth and success could never replace the joy found in human connection, in being present with the people who truly mattered. As time went on, Vincent began to reconnect with his daughter, Claire. It was slow, painful work. Years of resentment and silence didn't vanish overnight. But Claire, seeing the change in her father, slowly began to let go of the anger that had kept her distant. Their relationship was still fragile, still tentative, but it was better than it had been in years. Claire and Raina, once strangers, began to form their own bond, built on shared experiences, laughter, and an understanding of what it meant to be part of something bigger than oneself. The house that had once felt cold and empty was now filled with warmth and laughter. Raina, though still cautious, had begun to see herself as more than just an orphan, more than just a beggar. She had a place here. She had a family. And for Vincent, the success he had once measured in dollars and achievements was now measured in something far more valuable, the love and trust of the people he had come to hold dear. One evening, as they sat together at dinner, Vincent, Raina, and Claire, Vincent looked around the table and felt a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude. This was what life was really about. Not the endless pursuit of wealth, not the accolades or the titles, but the connections that bound them together. Raina, noticing the soft smile on his face, looked at him curiously. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Vincent smiled, his heart full. "I'm thinking about how far we've come, how much we've learned, about the things we can't buy, the things we can only give." Raina's eyes softened, and she nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "I think I understand now," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "I used to think that if I had enough money, enough things, I would be happy. But it's not about that, is it?" "No," Vincent said quietly, his voice filled with warmth. "It's never about that. It's about who you have beside you. It's about the people who see you, who choose you, even when you're not at your best." As they sat there together, sharing a quiet meal, Vincent realized that he had learned a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Money could buy comfort, but it could never buy what truly mattered. True wealth was found in love, in family, in connection. It was about showing up for each other, day after day, even when it wasn't easy. For Raina, this was the culmination of a dream she had never dared to fully imagine. She had gone from a girl who begged for scraps, who had no place to belong, to a young woman with a family that loved her. She had found the one thing that had always eluded her, a sense of belonging, a sense of worth. She knew she had a future now, a future where she could be herself, where she could dream, and where she could give and receive love freely. The journey had not been without its hardships. There had been setbacks, misunderstandings, and moments when both Vincent and Raina questioned the choices they had made. But in the end, they had found something far more powerful than any material possession could offer. They had found each other. Raina's journey had come full circle. She had gone from a girl lost on the streets, searching for scraps of kindness, to a young woman who had found a place in a family that cared for her deeply. Vincent, too, had come full circle, rediscovering the value of relationships and love. The life they shared was imperfect, but it was theirs, and it was real. And in that, they had both discovered the greatest lesson of all: that the greatest wealth in life is not measured in what you have, but in who you choose to share your life with. The story of Vincent and Reina was not one of sudden miracles or grandiose gestures, but of small daily decisions to be present, to care, and to try. They learned that no matter where you start, no matter how broken you feel, the journey toward healing and belonging is always possible. And that, in the end, is what makes all the difference. In a world that often values success over connection, wealth over love, Vincent and Reina found that the most valuable things in life are those we cannot see but can feel with every beat of our hearts: family, love, and the deep, unbreakable ties that bind us all. And that, perhaps, is the greatest gift of all. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.